these decisions that I'm looking at, I need to look at these decisions through the lens of my core values. And until I've taken the time to do that, I don't have that lens.
No, for sure. And if we bring that back to financial planning, that is so important, because else one is actually building a plan to satisfy things that's not really core of yourself. And you are chasing things that is not really important, or you think it's important, but it's not really the things that bring joy into your life, And then, interesting, myself and Craig don't know each other, but to a certain extent, we were both influenced by Glory Beth Jones in terms of her book that she wrote, The Path. And I'm going to share my story, and then Greg can also come in there. He's got a copy of the book. I've, by the way, got exactly this book with the same cover. Glory Beth Jones years ago wrote the book, The Path, and it was most probably now 50, most probably 17, 18 years ago.
This is 1996 was the copyright.
Yeah. So it was 1 year plus minus around this time of the year. I took some time out to think about what is important in life for me. And I actually did the exercise in that book in terms of values. And at that point in time, I got to the conclusion to say, if I can be busy with anything that I can help other people and organizations to grow and develop, then I'll be in a happy place. So that was at the core. And for many years, that was my guiding light to say, it then moved a little bit while I was busy with the financial coaching. It moved to a point where I'm now at the point to crystallize that further, is to say, it's still, if I can be busy with helping people and organizations to grow, however, I now call it financial prosperity for all, because that is for me an encompassing sentence to say, I want prosperity, but I also want all financial advisors and coaches I work to experience financial prosperity. And at the end of the day, all of us can then help clients to grow financial prosperity. And that's then driven by 4 core things that's important for me. Is learning is important for me, sharing is important for me, caring is important for me, and then lastly, experiences and exploring. So, which comes back a little bit to the things, but the exploring and is more having a fun holiday now and then, etc. And that just makes one's decision so much easier. And if one sometimes go through a dump in life, at least one know this, or for me, I know this is what I'm busy with. This is what is important for me, and I can be clear on that. On that, Greg, perhaps how did it guide you in terms of your journey?
Yeah. So first of all, I grew up in Hawaii, in a very poor household. So my focus around financial prosperity and wealth was really ingrained in the fact that my father, who was a disabled veteran, was not able to provide for our family financially. And so I grew up with this mindset around in order to be happy in life, I have to make a lot of money. I have to be wealthy and I have to make a lot of money. So early on, candidly, my values were distorted because they were very, very focused on purely making money and creating and being wealthy, excuse me. And even when I entered the industry in 1995 and they taught us values, I still use that through the lens of values as a means to an end, and the end is becoming wealthy. So I went to school at my undergraduate degree and my graduate degree are all in the area of finance. So I'm very prefrontal cortex thinking, rational, It's got to be in a spreadsheet. It's got to be in a algorithm, math. And if it doesn't, then it's not, doesn't have a lot of value. So this is how I entered the industry. And I would say for the first, say 10 years, from 95 to about 2005, it really was more about the wealth. Then I began to recognize I had reached this level of wealth, and I was working for Goldman Sachs at the time. I was a vice president. I was making more money than I ever thought possible, and yet I was not fulfilled. This is the existential crisis moment that I went through, and someone else recommended this book to me in 2006. I went through the process really to begin to understand my core values and learned that being wealthy was important, but that wasn't the most important thing in the world. I wanted to have a fulfilled life. I wanted to live more fully. At the time in 2006, my marriage was on the rocks. I was borderline obese. I had 3 children, but I didn't have a lot of relationship with my 3 children, but I was making a lot of money. And I went through this lens of the life that I live does not match up to the values that I've uncovered by going through these exercises. And so for me, and I believe for many, many, many advisors and coaches, but advisors, since that was the world that I lived in, I saw the exact same thing. I can tell you the story of one of my best friends in 2006, also at Goldman Sachs. He was even making more money than me. Underneath, he was going through a divorce and he was addicted to cocaine. And this is a gentleman who expressed in front of his clients these great values, but underneath, he was living a life that was destructive. And he came to the point of attempting suicide. Okay. Because when you live a life that is outwardly not matching who you are inwardly, the ultimate demise is something that can be just the worst thing possible. And he had 2 young children. So I went through this process in 2006, really to begin to understand how I was not living what my core values were. And more importantly, which we'll talk about, is I didn't really have a purpose in life at that point in time. I didn't understand why I was placed uniquely on this earth. The subtitle of this is How to Create a Mission Statement for Your Work and Life, which we call a personal purpose. And so that was what led me to finally discover, why am I here? What makes me unique? What do I contribute to the world that no one else can possibly contribute? And that was the beginning of a wealthfully life, which I now live.
Thanks for that, Greg. There's George Kinder always says that if you can only be a life planner if you've been life planned, and you know, for us that went through our own journey in terms of creating our own purpose statements, living it, it's so much easier. However, sometimes I find financial planners and coaches is afraid of having that conversation with clients. So how will a client react on this, having such a deep conversation? What was your own experience having value conversations with clients and positioning that, Craig, as part of the financial planning process? Because for me, it's nearly, you can nearly not start a financial plan or financial coaching conversation if you don't understand the values. That's just world according to Hendrik, but yeah.
And I agree with you today. The 36-year-old Greg Sloan would have said to you, that's a bunch of, mumbo jumbo. But so coming out of this December of 2006, I defined the first draft. I articulated the first draft of my personal purpose. I presented it to my boss at Goldman Sachs, and I said, here is who I believe I am, the best definition of the best version of me, and the role that I play does not match up. I have a different role that is something much more aligned with my purpose. And that role was not just to serve clients, but it was also to help coach our younger advisors internally in the firm. And his response to me was that doesn't exist in the Atlanta office. You have to move to New York City if you want that type of role. And I said, no, I'm not interested in moving. That's when I left and launched my own firm. Now, here's where I began to transition from where it was valuable for me to where it was valuable for clients. Because my initial thought was, this is not about clients. This is about me. I launched my firm in March of 2007. For those of you who have been around, this is the worst possible period of time to launch a wealth management investment advisory practice, because by the end of 2008 and then ultimately 2009, we saw the worst correction in the market that we had seen in our lifetime. I want to tell you a story of one client in particular that I had been working with since 2002. Very wealthy family or high income earning family. When I met them, they had $1 million US sitting in their checking account because they didn't trust anybody to help them. The gentleman was a senior executive at a publicly held company. He had stock options, restricted stock. There was a tremendous amount of wealth that this family possessed, and he was young. He was in his late 40s. In the middle of the crisis, towards the end of the crisis, he and his wife, their whole decision-making request of me went completely irrational. And they started to not just have a discussion with me, but started telling me what to do in terms of how to manage their investments. In simple terms, they freaked out. And what I learned was I didn't really understand their values, and I didn't really understand their purpose of wealth. And so they are the only client that I had that said in March of 2009, sell all my equities, get me completely out of the market. By this point, they had lost 50% of their money. I could not talk them out of it. And it really was so painful. I see this as one of the great failures in my career, because I had spent so much time helping them move from this extremely conservative posture to something that took risk in their portfolio. But yet when the market tumbled, I wasn't able to keep them off from jumping off the ledge. Now, I said that this client was in their late 40s. It took me years to get them slowly invested in the market. At this point in time, here's the crazy part of the story. Most of their money was still in cash and bonds. There was only a small portion, less than 40% of their wealth was tied to equities. But even that, from a risk profile, was too risky for them. And when I started to understand why they made the decisions that they did and really get into their values and their purpose, that changed me as an advisor in 2009. And by the time we started 2010, I said, purpose and values is not just critical for me, it's essential for me to understand this with my clients. And in 2010 is when I transitioned from being their financial advisor to also being their purpose and wealth coach. So I started coaching in 2010. Prior to that, I would say I was purely an advisor.
Gregor,
there's another.
Yeah, you can. No, you can throw in another story. That's fine.
Yeah. So let me tell you another story, and this is not my story. This is actually from another friend of mine who I used to work with at the time, and I ran into him about a year ago, and I was talking to him about Wealthfully and how we were building a software platform to help advisors really to dig deeper and get closer. And he just smiled at me. He says, "Greg, I want to tell you a story about one of my clients who is very, very wealthy." And this client said, "I am paying you to manage my portfolio, and I'm getting some other stuff for free." Okay. Some of this other stuff I'm getting is the coaching and whatnot. And he said, a few years into it, I realized that I was getting mostly this, and I was getting this at a discount. I was getting the portfolio management at a discount. 10 years into the relationship, I realized I am paying you for behavioral coaching and crisis management, and you're providing me the investment advice for free. So the client the customer, who was very wealthy, realized at some point in the journey that what the coach or advisor really provided was that relational decision-making partner, and allocating within investments, that was a little bit of a commodity. One question I have for you, Henrik, just so I'm understanding the audience, how many in the audience are what we would consider licensed financial advisors, meaning they're managing investments, and how many of the audience is coaches?
Around about, if I look at the audience, 50-50 at this point in time, Greg. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. That just helps me. So I just and as a reminder, and I don't know if you've shared this, I am no longer a financial advisor. I sold my firm in 2020, and I no longer manage investments.
Thanks for that, Greg. Any questions perhaps at this point in time from somebody from the floor before we take the conversation to the next part and let Greg share a little bit his own journey in terms of the business at etc. and the solution he's got. But just around values, when you are having values conversations, what questions do you get? What kickback do you get? I think the one important thing is, Honey, you can you're more than welcome to ask a question or give your opinion there.
No, sorry, I think I pressed a button here I wasn't supposed to. Apologies.
100%. I
actually don't know where to undo that.
No, that's fine.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sam speaking. My question is, how do you measure values? So you have a values conversation, or do you actually have some sort of values assessment in your coaching practice?
Henrik, do you want to?
You go first, Greg, and then I'll share my opinion. Then we've got two opinions in the room. So yeah, 100%.
So I'm going to answer how I did it in my practice, and then I'm going to answer differently how I do it today. So beginning in 2010, what I realized was that the questionnaire that I use, or what I call the discovery sessions, were the most important component of the relationship. And my discovery began before they became clients. I had a mindset shift for me as an advisor where I changed from I was the right advisor to as many clients as possible to I was the wrong advisor for most people. So my own values told me that most prospects were not good clients for me. So I began to set the stage and turn the table. And how I did this was I started sharing my values. So I didn't ask the client for theirs. I shared mine. I shared my purpose and I shared my values. Now that set the stage for the client to understand, or the prospect at this point in time. They understood how I was different, and they understood the expectations of them as a client. If you become my client, this is where we're going to begin. We're going to begin with a values conversation. And so it was manual at this period of my career. In 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, it was manual. It literally was pen and paper, and I would take a client intake. The discovery sessions for a client could last 3 meetings. And each meeting could be anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. Recognize I was working with very wealthy individuals. So for them to invest that time, they were looking for someone that was different. So I took a lot of time really understanding a client. I can argue that there were some clients that took us 10 hours over 3 meetings to really unpack some of this stuff. So it was not very efficient. It was not very scalable. It was a lot of time and energy and emotion. But that's really what I found it was necessary to get to underneath the skin. Now, of course, what I learned over time was that certain questions were more valuable than other questions. And so I went through who knows how many questions to ultimately find what are the most important questions that are repetitive that I can use over and over and over again. And that's where we developed our assessment out of, which we call trials and triumphs. You'll get to see that in a moment. But coming back to the question of how do you measure it, you have to articulate it before you can measure it, meaning you have to have it written down. You have to have something that says, okay, here's what my values are. Am I living them out? Yes or no? In other words, you have to have a scoring tool. And so we've built that using technology. Back then, it was pen and paper, and it was just more, does it feel right? Today, we've turned that into, can you actually measure it? And the answer is yes, you can measure it using technology.
Thanks for that, Greg. So I think the one thing that Greg also said, I think positioning it with the client, that the client understands, the discovery meeting is not what they most probably was up to this point used, that you're going to rock up and I'm going to ask you around your assets, liabilities, your investments, etc. Is most probably our first meeting is, I first want to understand you. I want to understand your values. I want to understand your aspirations. I want to understand your relationship with money. And if we understand that and you fit into my value proposition, and you're comfortable to work with me and I'm comfortable work with me, then we'll continue from there. That the client also understands that, or have got an expectation that the conversation will be different when we start the conversation, because I think nobody wants to be surprised, and this is being more personal. So positioning that with the client, I think, is critical. And and then having a process that you are also comfortable with engaging. I think that's the second thing, is that you are comfortable with the process and the conversation, because it's actually nothing else than having a conversation to really understand the customer in the process. So yeah.
So I'll tell you, obviously, everything we're talking about really boils down to communication. How do you communicate your value proposition? How do you communicate your process? How do you communicate who you are as an advisor? Communication, if you listen to the experts, they'll say it's 90%. It's less than 10% what you say. It's how you say it. It's the physical communication tools. Let me show you one physical communication tool that I used. Clients would walk in with a stack of paper. Okay, this is my financial life. I communicated what the priority of this was by physically taking the papers, moving them to a different side of the table, and dropping them, and said, we're not even going to talk about that yet. So I communicated a different methodology physically by saying these papers are not as valuable as the first thing we're going to talk about. So the process that I developed, let me back up. In 2009, again, this is at the bottom of the market. Actually, this is probably the summer of 2009 when I'm telling this story. One of my clients was a very, very senior executive with a large publicly traded company. He was by far my wealthiest client. And I went to a handful of clients and I asked the question, why did you leave Goldman Sachs to become a client of my little firm? Because I really wanted to understand from my clients, what did I bring to them that was most valuable? And one of these clients said, and I still remember to this day, I just had lunch with this guy 2 weeks ago. He said, Greg, because you bring a disciplined process for financial decision-making around what's most important to us. You bring a disciplined process around financial decision-making. In 2009, guess what, guys? I didn't have a disciplined process. And I just looked at him and I nodded my head and I said, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And then I went back to the office and I said, oh, shoot, I better come up with a disciplined process because he thinks I have one. So This is in 2009, and in 2010, I really began to understand what it was that we were doing with clients. What was the process that we had developed without really understanding it? And it boiled down to 5 things, which we eventually called the D5 process. D was the first letter of the firm that I launched. It was called Daniel Advisors. Daniel Advisors is not my name. Daniel is not my name. That, by naming my firm Daniel, which came from my values, the values of the firm, it gave me an opportunity to tell a story, which I can share a little later. But nonetheless, the D5 process worked like this, and you guys are free to write this down. I'm happy to share this with you. D1, the first thing was we helped clients to discover who they were, what we call discover your identity. Who are you at your core? A significant part of that was really unpacking their history. Everything from where they were born. Tell me about your parents. Tell me about your grandparents. Was there something in their life? Was there a story that somehow shapes the way you think about money? And we would always commonly hear stories like, my grandfather lost everything in this crash of 1929. My grandfather had money stolen from him. My mother was swindled by somebody. So there was always some story that created their identity. D2 was to define their purpose of wealth. Okay, we have an understanding of your history, the past. Now let's define the future. Define your purpose of wealth. D3 was detail your resources. Detail, what is the detail? And detail for us was significantly captured in a balance sheet or a net worth statement. So when I said detail your resources, let's put it on pen and paper. What do you have to work with? D4 was to design a plan. Now we know where you're from, we know where you're headed, and we know where you are today. D5 was discipline your choices. That was it. That was the magic behind what allowed us to scale Daniel Advisors in 2010 and ultimately sell it in 2020. When I sold the firm, by the way, I retained the intellectual property around the D5 process. Let me tell you one more secret within this formula that may sound unusual. Particularly if you're are there any certified financial planners here?
Yeah, yes, a few on the call. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a certified financial planner, got my designation in 2000, I believe. This process is not the way the CFP board and the CFP materials teach it. And what I learned through my career was that the CFP board taught you start with where a client is today. Start with the present, then you talk about the future. I didn't start with the present. I started with the past. Okay, someone on here says, financial and menopause therapist. As a therapist, you can teach us like why it's so important to understand if there's any trauma. Okay. So I wasn't providing therapy. I want to be careful about this. I was not providing therapy. I was providing coaching, but it was important for me to dig at least a little bit into the past. And if there was significant trauma, many clients would either get referred to or were already working with a therapist. But I started with the past, and then I skipped over the present and I went to the future. I did not go past, present, future. I went from the past to the future. I didn't realize how valuable that was until I realized how valuable that was. And the reason why I skipped over the present was because what I found where many clients were stuck. If you started talking about where they were today, they were so emotionally burdened by what they saw as failures in their life that they had lost their ability to dream about the future. So where did you come from, and what is the dreams that you envision for yourself in the future? Because if you talk about those two things, then the present is simply a data point between these two periods of time. And so the present will always be with you, Because when you meet with them, I used to meet clients mostly on a quarterly basis. We would always talk about, okay, where do we want to go and where are we today? Where do we want to go? Where are we today? But we always focused on the dreams and the purpose of the client in the future. The values were how you carried those decisions into the future. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this. So Henrik, please feel free to interrupt if I get too long-winded.
No, but I think you make an interesting point and a valid point that I'm also pondering on for some time. Is I think that's the one problem I've also got with naming the sixth step of this financial planning process a review meeting, because I cannot change anything in the past or reviewing since I last saw the client. So in my mind, it's always a future planning meeting. Okay, we do discuss what milestones are you hitting and being your accountability partner, etc. For me, also not practicing as a practicing financial advisor or licensed advisor, but as financial coach, is always talking about, are you having the right disciplines in place, etc. However, the conversation is a future conversation, And I think what was beautiful about that story that you told about your friend, that the client over time said, I'm actually paying you for managing behavior and making sure that my behavior, my purpose, etc., is in place, So yeah.
Yeah, he called it behavior coaching and crisis management.
That's it. Because the crisis management again touches on that we are continuously will at certain points in time go through life transitions that we sometimes planned and sometimes we brought it on ourselves, but there's also just being retrenched from a job that you don't know, or all of those things that happen that can influence our clients, which fit for me in that crisis management, So, Greg, if we then jump a little bit more to you shared a little bit about your own story, but if you can perhaps take us through, the development, from paper-based right through to where you are now, and show us a little bit of the technology. And whoever wants to ask something, you're more than welcome to just pop in, and both of myself and Greg is more than welcome to have
Sorry,
your voice.
Greg, can I just ask you to go over a little bit more about number 5? Once you've obviously got the plan, designed the plan, then discipline your choices. Just a little bit more embellishment on that.
Sure. Let me show you a let's see here. I want to show you a visual diagram that I created back. Can you see this?
Yes,
yep.
Positive.
Okay, so this was the D5 process. And so and you can see what the step 2, which is define your purpose, was really critical to this. So we discovered your past. What is your DNA? Where do you come from? Define your purpose, detail, design, and discipline. And what I learned was that being disciplined always goes back to your purpose. Your discipline goes back to what is your why? Why do you believe that wealth is important to you? Why do you believe that you are a steward of this wealth? What is your ultimate purpose of this wealth? And I'll share with you some stuff from Fidelity as well that they have found. But ultimately, when you get into the discipline of choices, so I think of at the end of the day, what you are every single one of you, whether you're an advisor, a coach, a therapist, I don't really care what your title is, you are there to help people make better decisions. You are here to help people make better decisions. Discipline, if you instill discipline into the decision-making process, you're going to make better decisions. My wife is a health coach, okay? I shared with you I was borderline obese. I actually was technically in that category. And so I have some health issues currently as a result of that. Okay. I had made a lot of poor decisions in my life from a intake standpoint and from a lack of exercise and movement. And what I learned a few years ago was that I was making bad choices about the type of food I ate relative to my predisposition, health predisposition, and I was not moving, I was not exercising like I should. My wife got me to download this app called MyFitnessPal. MyFitnessPal was a tool that helped me become more disciplined about my decisions of nutrition and movement. When you're working with a client, a customer, a patient, in helping them make better financial decisions, you know that if you can provide discipline around the, sometimes it's really starts with what decisions not to make. Okay, I'll give you one simple discipline. Don't make rational decisions if it's a crisis. If it's in the middle of a crisis, don't try to make too many quick decisions. Really go through, talk it over with your spouse. Call me up. Every one of my clients had my cell phone. That one wealthy client, by the way, that I told you the story about the discipline process, he was faced with a very challenging job, a good thing, but it was a job offer. He called me at 10 o'clock one night, and he knew well enough that he had the right to call me this, because he and his wife were having to face one of the most difficult decisions about leaving where he had spent his career, 25 years, and going to another job. If it wasn't for all of the work that we did prior to this phone call, we would not have had the plan to make the disciplined decision against. That ended up being, from a financial perspective, one of the best decisions. His net worth quadrupled. He's probably worth over $50 million today. He was probably worth $10 million at the time of this phone call. But because we had a plan and we knew we were making decisions against this document, these were living documents that we created, and it included an aspirational wealth statement, basically a purpose of wealth statement. When we had this document to compare against, and faced with a decision. Sorry, Siri thought I was talking to her. You have the ability to say, okay, here is what we've spent months, weeks, months, maybe even years putting together. You're faced with a critical decision. How does that get measured against what we've put together? And so that's what we did. And oh, by the way, some of these decisions really even boil down to nuts and bolts. Like, should we buy a car or should we lease a car? Should we own a second home or should we not own a second home? Should we own a third home? That particular client I'm talking about, we went through this process of whether they would own a third home. They were wealthy enough to own 2 homes, and he wanted a beach condo. And they could afford it. And when we went through this process, they ultimately realized, based on their values and their purpose, owning a third home added more complexity to their life that didn't match up with their values. And he chose not to buy it.
Perhaps just a thought, and I'll pop the web address for you in the chat. There's an app where Greg now referred to the WealthPal or HealthPal is it's nudgecoach.com. You can go and try it out. The free version, you can put 5 clients on, but what it's nice is you can actually design when your client needs to, especially working with somebody that perhaps they have to curb their spending or whatever the case may be, and it's new, a new behavior that they must put into place. You can actually design it and automate it. So it sends then a reminder to the client. You can set it every day or every second day or every week, depending on how frequent they must get the message, and it then pops it. You can make it like, the client committed to do 3 things, whatever the case may be, and then it automatically pops to the client, and the client can tick or can even give you feedback, and it comes through to you. So yeah, on that discipline one, perhaps. Yeah.
Nudge coach. Beautiful.
Yeah. Greg, you can continue your story.
You want me to share some exercises?
Yeah, anytime.
Okay.
Perhaps while you're jumping into the exercises, I see you also a CPA member, Exit Planning Institute, so which works with family businesses as such. How do you see this coming into the work you're doing now? Because I think that's important one, where one don't. It's so important to have one person's value, but then having a spouse's value, but then working with family businesses, having a family purpose statement that guides the family in terms of where the business goes. So, this is actually so applicable to our world of work through irrespective of the clients, because especially family businesses where most probably they actually want to go from generation to generation. We do work with those that we need to help to get to a point to have an optimal exit. But in most cases, family businesses actually want to go over from one generation to another one.
Yes. So my work today is no longer managing investments. I help wealthy families, particularly that operate businesses, that have operating businesses, to continue to expand and create a legacy of wealth. So it's no longer just about one generation, it's about second generation and even third generation. So I have a higher level model called the Power Plan, which the P stands for purpose of wealth. Again, everything comes back to it's all purpose centered. So I'll give you an example. One of my clients that I work with today. So this is a gentleman that I've worked with their family for many years. Most of the years was managing investments, and they eventually became a family coach, and even began working with both sons, and then we've re-engaged, but this time under a fractional CFO, a purpose CFO for the family model. So these are families that are typically between a net worth of $10 million to $50 million. This particular family is somewhere in that $15, $20 million range. The G1, Generation 1, is 67 years old. Generation 2 are 32 and 34 years old for the sons, and of course they have grandchildren. This is a family who has a particular expertise in a certain type of real estate investing. And so I'm coming in and creating a generational purpose of wealth, because his desire is that this doesn't just impact his sons. I think he has 4 grandchildren right now. The oldest is 7 years old. He really is beginning to view this through the lens of his grandchildren. And one of the things that we're working on, I'm seeing him in about 10 days, is the family governance. Okay. So think about the family governance, very similar to that family purpose profile that we described, except now it's generational. So when we talk about family governance, we're really talking about how do you maintain this wealth for 100 years? There is an adage and a truth in generational wealth that is summed up in this tagline: from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Is anyone familiar with that? Okay. Carrie, I'd love for you to share with the group. What does that mean?
So, I mean, it's like for somebody, you grow up with nothing. You've got that impetus to work hard, to strive, to push your discomforts. You make the money. Your kids grow up surrounded by wealth and ease, and don't necessarily have that same drive and ambition. And they tend to squander that money, and their children grow up
without wealth. Yeah.
What is the percentage? Do you know what the percentage of families that create wealth end up in this reality?
No, I don't. I'd love to know.
So there's this, the statistic is a family business and wealth. I think it's less than 10%, maybe even less than 5% make it to that third generation. I know here in the United States, probably one of the most famous stories is the Vanderbilt. If you guys are familiar with that family, Anderson Cooper, who is on CNN News, he is one of the, I think he's the third or fourth generation. He inherited nothing from the original Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a tycoon. He was one of the wealthiest people on the planet at the turn of the 19th century. And to have the family members to squander that wealth is just abysmal. Compare that to a family like a Rockefellers, who on the opposite end, they created a governance policy. They created, and candidly, Henrik, it really comes down to family values, purpose and values, where that becomes the core of who they are. You've heard the families will say, well, we don't do things that way because we are a Crawford or Crawford. Craffords don't do that. Rockefellers don't do that. Kennedys don't do that. So it really comes back to, you have to create the value structure. I have a model that we do that with for those families at the first generation. And this is where this is the type of work I do today, which is even more, it's so fulfilling for me. And in a little bit of personal disclosure, about 3 months ago, I received a check from a trust that my great-grandfather, he passed away in 1961. I'm the fourth generation. I inherited from something my great-grandfather did in his business. He was a wealthy business person. Now that trust got distributed to many, many people, but I was one of his great-grandsons. He instilled values in our family. And so there is some money that passed to the fourth generation. So I'm blessed with being a benefactor of this.
Greg, if I may ask, I'm sure you're going to explain later, but I'd love to hear the story behind the name, Daniel.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so, before you forget.
Thank you. So in 2007, it was a Friday afternoon, and I was meeting with my attorney on Monday, this particular Monday, and I had no name. I was going through the list of Compass and Horizon and Lighthouse and all of the traditional analogies that you can think of when you're looking for a financial advisor. That Saturday morning, I woke up and we had just started attending a new church. And my wife said to me, the pastor of the church wants us to read from Daniel, the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6, because he's not going to have a chance to read the whole book, but he wants us to read it in advance. So I opened the book of Daniel. I had not done this. This is the first time we got this email from the pastor, and I was like, this is silly, but okay, fine. I'll do what he asked, because it was a brand new church and we wanted to be good members. So I read in Daniel chapter 6. If anyone knows the story of Daniel, he's a Hebrew exile that has been brought into the Babylonian Empire. And there was a coup that was put together against Daniel to throw him into the lion's den. And it was said of his peers that they could not find anything wrong with Daniel because he was trustworthy, he was not corrupt, and he was not negligent. And when I read that scripture, I thought, voila, this is exactly what you're looking for when you hire an advisor. You want a person who's trustworthy, who's not corrupt, and is not negligent. And I said, that's the name of the firm. These are the values that we uphold as a firm. And so that's therefore the name. Now, what it allowed me to do was when people would call me and say, now tell me about the name, they were asking me, what are the values of your firm? And I'll tell you, that set us apart. It was almost like shooting fish in a barrel. Prospects No one else was talking this way. None of our competitors were talking about being trustworthy, not corrupt, not negligent. And they were talking about their performance. They were talking about their software. They were talking about other things that the prospects that I sat in front of that were mostly executives or entrepreneurs. They were looking for a Daniel advisor because they knew that they faced decisions and they needed someone to be able to be there when things got tough. And it worked beautifully. Thank you for asking. I still love sharing this story. When I sold the firm in 2020, one of the things that the company who bought my firm recognized the value of that story and of that name. I had to agree not to start another business with the name Daniel for 5 years. That's how valuable even the buying firm realized the brand behind our name was. So what I'd love to do is I'm going to start with the end. So my consulting practice is called telos, and telos is a Greek word that I sort of translate to begin with the end in mind. So I'm going to follow my own system here. I'm going to show you the end. And then I'm going to come back to where we are today. And the end for our software is to help other advisors to become similar to Daniel advisors and to become their client's purpose CFO. So this is a report that is not, this part of the software is not completely ready yet, but it'll give you an idea of where we're headed. So it begins with, can everyone see that?
Yes, correct.
And I'm happy to, Hendrik, I sent this to you, but I can send this out. So when we say purpose of wealth, at this point in where we were doing this, we literally created 2 different purpose profiles, one for husband, one for wife. I'm showing you, this is a real person, one of my clients I worked with for 20 years, a senior executive, and this is another female. These 2 people are not married to each other, but these are 2 of my favorite purpose statements. So John was an executive with AT&T, and he had achieved a level of wealth and income, but he really wasn't fulfilled. And what we really uncovered was, what makes him unique and different? And he came up with this: my purpose is to lead others to live a synthesized, integrated life. And how he saw his role within the organization, at the time it was a spinoff from AT&T, was he was a leader. He had up to 12,000 people that worked under him at this point in time. And he wanted he saw his role within the organization as not just making the shareholders money, but really to invest in his people. This is, obviously these are not their real names. This was a female, retired. She was a CEO of a pharmaceutical company. And she came up with, my purpose is empower others to succeed by managing priorities in life. And she was one who hated to see inefficiencies and people that being unproductive with their life, whether it was her direct employees or children or her real estate tenants. She actually owned a ton of real estate and got into helping her tenants make decisions. But ultimately, this was the purpose of wealth, which led to another, which was the pinnacle of a model we called retire. Starts with purpose, and then retire was the acronym that supported their purpose. So retire stood for retirement, estate planning, tax, investments, risk management, and employee benefits, as you see there. And the Wealthfully plan was around, how do we achieve this purpose of wealth? And then how do we boil it down into disciplined actions? Remember, I talked about those actions. So these are the bullet points. So for instance, for retirement, they needed to save 10% of their earnings. This gentleman wanted to wanted to do full-time work until age 64 and then transition to teaching by age 65. They wanted a maximum discretionary spending in their life of 40%, which means that the rest of it was non-discretionary. They wanted to travel, they wanted to do things. For their estate plan, it boiled down to having a joint trust with with a pour over will. I'm not going to go through the details, but these are the details. That remember when I said D4, design my plan, this is the output of D4. Make sense?
Makes sense, Greg.
And then you can boil each one of those down into metrics. Am I 10%, 30%, 50%, 70%? This is where the software will help you to score how you're doing in each one of these components. So I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm going to switch to, this is the website, which everyone obviously has access to. So the website and the software is called Wealthfully, and Wealthfully is the combination of two words, wealthy and fulfilled. Because what I learned through my career was that I helped a lot of families become wealthy, either create wealth or maintain wealth, but I didn't help them. I wasn't able to help all of my families with fulfillment, being fulfilled. I had a lot of wealthy families that were dysfunctional, and I hated that. Okay, so really it's about helping clients to achieve their purpose of wealth, pursue and achieve their purpose of wealth using technology. These are the exercises, the key exercises, which come from that D5 process. So purpose DNA is identity. That's the beginning of this journey. This doesn't necessarily follow this website here doesn't necessarily follow the D5 exactly, but it includes trials and triumphs, which is how we help clients articulate their core values. It includes a behavioral assessment called Friction EQ. I think some of you are probably familiar with financial DNA. We're similar but different to financial DNA, but the core foundation of the tool is helping clients to define their purpose of wealth and what we also call a promise statement. So their personal purpose and personal promise. The report today, I told you where we're going to end up, but where we are today is able to produce this. So that's just a cover sheet that would go to the client. Here's what we call the purpose snapshot. These are my core values, full disclosure. So when I went through the exercise over the years, I ended up with these being my 6 core values. Being a good father figure, financial stability and security, finding my core passions in life, education and learning, building key relationships, and being a mentor to others. So when I look at my life in the decisions that I make today, I measure them against these core values in my life. The identity and types, what we call my purpose types, comes from a McKinsey study that found that when we use that word purpose, individuals gravitate to these 9 different types where they live out their purpose: achievement, freedom, enjoyment, conservation, respect, stability, caring, tradition, and equality. And when you go through the exercise and your clients go through the exercise, they have to select 3 out of the 9. Real quickly, this is the output for Friction EQ. Friction EQ is an assessment that helps you understand, first and foremost, how do you respond to stress? This is similar to the output looks similar to a DISC profile. The PhD that helped us build it says this is a little more based on the theories of Myers-Briggs. But nonetheless, we have a certain profile, a behavior profile that we make decisions in a healthy state. But as stress rises, many of us, our behavior changes. And if your behavior changes to something else, you move in a different direction. And so what we've come up with is an assessment to help you understand how does stress change your behavior? Because going back to behavioral coaching and crisis management, where we as coaches and advisors really, really provide value is at some of the greatest is under crisis. And so in order for us to serve clients in crisis, it's incumbent upon us to understand, how does crisis and stress change how they make decisions? I can share in a later point the psychology behind this, but bottom line, it's rooted in the 3 different areas of our brain development, from the rational to the emotional to the reactional. And this is pulling a little bit from that reactional lizard brain, if you will.
Yeah, it makes sense that it's based on Myers-Briggs, because Myers-Briggs has got the dark side, or your swap side, very much also as the Enneagram, that you've got the alternative.
Yeah, shadow. I mean, there's so many different ways to describe it. We're really big fans. We used Enneagram originally in our software. We did not have our own tool. The reason why we built our own tool was for 2 things. Number one, Enneagram, to get it really accurate, takes about 100 questions, and people didn't want to go through 100 questions. And so when we first launched our software, our first client was life coaches and executive coaches, not financial coaches. And the life coaches and executive coaches said, my clients are not going to do that. It's just too long. So come up with a better tool. We went looking for another tool, found one that was good, but not great. And so we ended up hiring the PhD to build our own. And that was a few years ago. So real quickly, going into back to the software, the way it works now is that we give the coach or the advisor, we give the coach or the advisor sort of the keys to decide when their client would go through different exercises. When we first launched it, we launched it where the client or the customer had access to all the tools and they didn't know what to do. And we found that didn't work. And so now we've created a different model where the coach or the advisor gets the portal, and then you decide which exercises that the client should take based on your relationship. So remember, we talked about the core values. So Trials and Triumphs is our tool to help clients to uncover their core values. The way the software works is there is a gate. The gate is crossed by entering the email that you have put into the system. Okay, so when a client goes in, they enter their email, you give them access, and where is it? Here it is. And then they go into the software. Hendrik has gone through this. So this is the Trials and Triumphs, and it's very simple. There's a video that's actually missing, but they would get a video of this is how you complete the exercise. And it starts with listing 10 trials that they've gone through in their life and 10 triumphs that they've gone through in their life. Very simple. This takes about, 10 minutes-ish, 15 minutes. Many individuals would say, I have core values. But then when you ask them, well, where do these core values get formed and where do they come from? They don't know. And so this is an exercise that teaches us your core values have come from the trials and the triumphs in your life because they've shaped who you are and what is important to you. And so as you go through this, you fill all this out, and then you essentially, I'd have to go through it to get to the answer, but you basically start stack ranking what is really the most important, and then you synthesize it into your top 6. So that's Trials and Triumphs. Oops. Let me go back.
Yeah, the Trials and Triumphs, what I thought when I was completing it is that also helps the conversation around my relationship with money and my early memories around money, because some of those will most probably have impacted my relationship with money. So that is also nice that it's included there. Other than that, like you say, that it shapes our values, it also refers to, that conversation to better understand what is the things that have shaped also our relationship with money, you know? So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Purpose DNA is that exercise I told you that has 9 different things. You start with 9 different descriptions, purpose types, as Mackenzie described it. So achievement, being the most influential person in my group, having high status and power. Conservation, working against threats of the environment, raising awareness of importance. Caring. So what you're doing is you're giving clients the ability, a simple way to say, what are the things that create your purpose? How do you see your money being used? How do you see your own self being used to improve the world? Helping make the world a better place for others. Once you select these 3, you continue on. Then we give you another. I'm going to go back and select 3 others. You continue on. Now you know sort of what's important to you, but how do you actually show up in the world? You show up in the world in the way you impact the world. Impact is seen through verbs. How do you actually, for instance, if one of my purpose types is to show others respect, how do I actually do that? So then we give the user a drop-down list of verbs that they select. Okay, empower. That's really how I see myself. I like to empower others. I like to show others appreciation. Let's say encourage. That's a verb that means something. I'm just going to pick randomly here. Okay, so you go through the software, and Hendrik will confirm this is very similar to the purpose, the path, exercises. We've just created software around it. Once you selected these 9 impact verbs, now you have a list of verbs that are most meaningful to you. You as an individual show up and impact others. Now you get to stack rank them. What is, the word encourage, that is really the most important thing to me. I really see myself as encouraging others, or I really like to help people experience or empower. So let's say those are the top 3. You continue on. Now you've created a purpose, a DNA of those top 6 things: respect, tradition, enjoyment, encouragement, experience, and power. That's it for that exercise. Again, that one is probably that could be as short as 3 minutes, as long as 10 minutes. What we are doing is we're giving the client tools to become more self-aware. And we're giving the advisor a tool to help understand their client at the deepest possible level. Now, I remind you, when I was doing this back in 2010, 11, 12, I was literally handing out pieces of paper. This is so much faster than it was. And you've completed that exercise. Now it gets to the meat, which is purpose and promise. And this is about helping people to tell their purpose story. What is the journey that they've been on? And it's a simple intake exercise. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? Was it upper class, middle class, lower class family? How were the relationships in your family? Was there high healthy, or were they unhealthy? We're using a process in psychology called progressive disclosure, which says you start with really simple questions and you progressively get people to disclose more and more of their underbelly. We've gotten this down to about 20 questions. Where'd you go to school? What'd you major in? How'd you start your career? What'd you love as a child? How did your mom inspire you? How did your dad inspire? What did your parents teach you? Tell me about the formative experiences. What was the first life-altering adult decision you made? What is the most trying adversity you faced? What are your top 3 God-given talents? What are you qualified to teach others about? How could you improve yourself? What are the passions? Other than your family, what are you most passionate about? What we're doing is we're collecting data, just like you would in a discovery session, which you're then going to feed back to the client through the piece of software. Now that you've collected, once you get through this, you've collected all this data. We know their purpose type. We know the way they want to impact the word. We know that the experiences and the stories they've had in their life. Now we're going to piece it all together by feeding it back to them and allowing them to select and to create their purpose statement. So in this case, I just selected three different things. My purpose is empower others to that perseverance will pay off so they can teach others about entrepreneurship. Okay, so this is a little bit of a, don't worry about the grammar on this screen because it's just a formula. If you guys have ever played that game, Mad Libs, we're simply getting them to play a game, which they then can say, okay, now I can, my purpose is to empower others to, let's see, power others through that perseverance will pay off through entrepreneurship. Something like that. And so they've created their first draft. This could take anywhere from 8 minutes to 20 minutes. Some people take an hour to do it. But what you're doing is you're helping them write that first draft. This can be their final draft. Typically, it's not. Then you ask them to score it. Whoops. Oh, okay. Well, there's another missing screen in there where you can actually score it on a scale of 1 to 6. Is this perfect? Does it need to be a little bit modified? What we have found is the first time they write it, it's a score of about 5 out of 6. And so it needs a little bit of tweaking. This is where you, as the advisor or the coach, you can help them to get this to the point that is perfect. Now you're involved in the process. We're not trying to remove you from the relationship. We're giving you tools to get deeper into these relationships. And I realize we've got about 8 minutes left. So I want to stop here and open it up for questions. And I apologize if I ran a little long here.
No, that's fine, Greg. It was very insightful. So any questions, thoughts from the initial conversation, also the software, etc. Anybody thoughts that you would like to share? Gary?
I'm just thinking in terms of crisis management and what you're saying about behavioral change. Obviously, a client might come to you in the middle of a crisis. So how much of these values and the discovery calls, I mean, it's quite difficult to be digging into a place where somebody's thinking is a little bit muddled by trauma or crisis, or they're paralytic in their thinking.
Yeah, so that's why you have the document, right? That's why you have something to refer to. You think about the crisis that we've just gone through in the pandemic with corporate America. Well, this is with global organizations. CEOs and executives had to make critical decisions. If you look back through the studies now, what they will say is something like 70% of CEOs said the purpose of their organization was the most critical thing that helped them to lead through this crisis. They had to go to the very root. Why do we exist as an organization? And if we understand why we exist, then we understand what's necessary for us to, we are necessary to exist for the world in the future. So therefore, we have the ability to make critical crisis decisions. Unfortunately, some of those decisions included letting people go that weren't critical to the organization. Same thing exists for families. In the middle of a crisis, you let assets go, you let relationships go, you really pull down to what is the most important thing about why we exist, and what, again, we call your purpose of wealth, because crisis does lead to making critical decisions. When you make critical decisions, we want you to make them with the combination of the 3 parts of your brain. You're rational, you're emotional, and you're reactional. Tracy, our therapist, can back me up on this, right?
So also perhaps for those of you that followed our course, is that's the purpose of the one-page agenda. Is the purpose statement is at the top, and then is the aspirations, the goals that the client want to pursue that, support that, and then what is that most probable life transitions and crises that can come up that we can mitigate, and then most probably next is the action steps, and lastly the things that cannot be done now, but we need to look out for that in the future. And that's on one page. And I agree 100% with Craig, is that when the crisis comes up, it's much easier to say, okay, let's just go and look, what is the purpose statement? What is the purpose statement for husband, wife, and for the family, if we work with the family unit? And what was the main goals, and what was the initial why of this aspirations? And if you now go and withdraw from that money, how is that impacting the bigger picture? In some cases, it will be that it must happen. At least there was a filter that we had to discuss before we make those decisions. So, yeah.
I'll close with these two things. And then I was having lunch with a friend of mine who a few weeks ago, I was not his advisor. I don't know who he worked with way back when, but when he started his company in the 90s, they got to a point where he had to cash in his 401k and his 401k, his wife's 401k and IRA to keep the company afloat. And ultimately, he was able to sell the company for multi-millions of dollars. So it did pay off in the end. He's now in a different business. But what he said was that they really had to look deep into their eyes to each other, right, as husband and wife, to say, what is the purpose of this IRA 401k, right? It's to help us to live this more wonderful life. It's not so that it sits there until 59 and a half, which is the rules here in the United States, in the US. There is a purpose for this money that we set it aside. And we believe that the best use of this money is to invest in our business. Ultimately, it paid out. I'm not saying that that's the right decision for everybody else. But when you really, really understand why you believe you are called to manage your resources, your financial resources, then you really have the ability to make those decisions. I will close with this. Every advisor says they can help clients reach their financial goals. Every advisor. If that is what you're preaching, you're not unique. Most advisors and coaches claim to help clients to chase their dreams, but only a select few can help clients to pursue their purpose of wealth. Who do you want to be?
Thank you very much, Greg. It was a lovely practical session for me. I think I made quite a list of things that I can take away from today's session. So thanks for that. We were blessed to have you with us. And thank you for all of you that joined the call, because myself and Craig will have a nice conversation, but it was so much nicer to be able to share it with all of you. And yeah, all of the best for your practices, for the month that's ahead. And thank you very much for being part of the conversation. So thanks.